course, we'll branch out a bit from there, but only a bit since we don't have that much time.
Shall I go last then? Okay, all right. Well, some of you may have heard me this morning. My name is Jude Kelly. I'm the Artistic Director of the South Bank Centre. And 8 years ago, I started a festival called WOW, Women of the World. And some of those sessions are here today with my colleague Hannah Poole. I started the festival because I felt sad that as a woman who'd managed to get to a very significant place from really quite lowly background, I was in a situation where I was watching so many women silencing themselves about so many things. Now, I can only speak about my experience of being British and what rape is like in Britain and all the conversations I've then had around the world with women because of the festival. And if I had to say we had one thing in common, it would be violence against women. And the idea that somehow this violence against women, and particularly sexual violence, is the woman's shame. I mean, it seems to me that rape, and my guess is that in this room, statistically, many of us would say, yes, we have been sexually violated or raped. And I would say, if I trigger anything, apologise, but it's so amazing how many women bury the subject and how many communities insist on burying the subject and how everybody colludes to make a woman feel that she must silence one of the most traumatic things that have happened to her. And I began to create these rape testimony sessions in WOW, where I basically said, if you have had a violation and you feel able to move from feeling as if you have to be silent to something where you could speak out, you would make it possible for so many more women to then speak out, girls and women. And I started these sessions, and we got more and more women who said, I'm terrified, I've never spoken about it in public, but I'm going to try. And out of those testimonies came groups of women who then started touring schools, talking to children and young people, and having online conversations. And I think we can reach a tipping point where women say, actually, it isn't our shame, and it isn't our blame, and we're going to talk about it together. But it has to be a kind of movement to reach a critical mass where everybody says, okay, we're in this together.
Good afternoon. My name is Poole. I'm an African feminist author and professor of African literature at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. How do I come to this topic? Well, I'm a feminist in the world. I'm a woman in the world. I wrote a book called Rape, a South African Nightmare, which came out in 2015. And I did so because for a variety of reasons, because in South Africa we spend a lot of time talking about rape. But I think that there are various things that are very wrong, very limiting about how we talk about rape. And so I was interested in trying to figure out, first of all, why the rape crisis, which in some respects is global, but I was looking at the kind of global linkages, but I was also looking at what it is about specific rape culture in South Africa historically and in the contemporary moment that enables a country to both obsessively talk about rape in its popular, in its public, in its official discourse, but not seem to make any inroads. So I was looking at the kind of historical, how we got here, and so on. And of course I'd been working, and of course I'd been I think as many of us in the world, committed to making some kind of contribution to creating a rape-free future, which I think we have to create. And so that's my most recent entry into it. But of course, I'd worked in my 20s I'd worked in rape crisis centers, had been a rape crisis counselor, and had done various other work with feminists both in South Africa and different parts of the continent and the world in different feminist work, but also specifically in anti-gender-based violence, violence against women work.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laure Beaufils. I'm the UK Deputy High Commissioner here in Nigeria, based in Lagos. The reason I'm on this panel is that I care hugely about women's rights, and my story started when I was relatively young, working in Cambodia at the time, working on violence against women and working on sex work. And I befriended a lot of sex workers at the time and learned about what it is like to suffer rape or to have to sell your body for an income. And on the back of that, I did a master's in gender and development and resolved to put the issue of women's rights at the heart of everything that I do, which is what I'm now trying to do in my diplomatic career here in Nigeria. Having arrived in Nigeria about 9 months, what struck me was that there were incredibly formidable women with such strong voices that are sassy, no nonsense, and that will just not suffer fools, but equally a critical mass of women who are voiceless and quite a prominent patriarchy. My take, or the lens I take on rape, is that it's fundamentally about whether you value women and girls, and it's fundamentally about power and exploitation of vulnerability. So it's always, if a girl or woman is raped, it's fundamentally because a man who has power has decided that he will use that power against a vulnerable woman or girl. It's something I think we need to speak about a lot more. It's pervasive, and this is why I wanted to be here today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Oluwaseun Ayodejo Showabi, and I run a foundation called Stand to End Rape Initiative. Why did I start the organization, and why am I here today? Around 2013, I would read stories online about girls who had been defiled, and I would see the narrative they used to express these young girls had been defiled. And I would see maybe Chiamaka was raped, but I never got to see the name of the rapist. And I also never got information about what had happened to the lady. Did she get any medical help? Was there any legal help? Was there any help at all that was available to her? So I kept reading the stories, but it didn't really hit me because I didn't understand what the Chiamaka lady might have gone through. So in 2011, I experienced sexual violence. And that's where everything changed for me, because at the time, there were no support services available for me in the state I was as a core member. And so I thought to myself, this is a major issue. If I read about it on a daily basis, and I have also experienced it, and there is no form of support for me or for the ladies I've read about, what exactly am I going to do about it? So in 2014, the organization started basically to provide support services to everyone who has experienced, not everyone because that's exaggerating, but for those who I get to know, or that my team members and I get to know, that have experienced any form of sexual violence at all. And what do? We provide medical, legal, and psychosocial support. And why I'm here today is because I believe that everyone here, myself inclusive, we have so much work to do on changing how rape is presented, or how we even understand the concept, or what we do about it, what we say about it. I also am interested in seeing what each and everyone as a community can actually do individually to address the issues of sexual violence within their confines. Because sometimes we hear about sexual violence in a very, very close space, but we ignore it because, after all, it's not really me it happened to. It's somebody else, so I can't really understand their pain. So I'm just here to learn and also to share the little experience I have gained from working with survivors of sexual violence.
Thank you very much, everyone. So I want to address this first question to you, Pumla. You mentioned the fact that rape is discussed very publicly and almost obsessively in South Africa, and I think we have a similar thing here where there are very public conversations. There are lots of people who are vocal about being against sexual violence, and yet rape continues to happen because it seems as if we make rapists safe in our societies. So I would like us, starting with you, to share some of your ideas about what it is in the way we talk about rape that makes people feel safe enough to continue raping.
Thank you. I think that several things happen. I mean, I think that, first of all, this appearance of, well, the fact that we're talking about rape so much makes it seem as though we care about rape as much as we talk about it, right? And so, in many ways, the talking about it becomes an excuse for doing some of the work that we need to do in order to end a rape culture. What do I mean? So in South Africa, for example, and I think in Nigeria and in various other places, we speak about rape as a moment. So we're shocked around. So when there's a prominent rape, then everybody's shocked and nobody quite understands, and we pay attention to that particular incidence of rape, right? But the focus, of course, is on the survivor or the victim. And that person becomes hyper visible, and there may be hundreds of rapes happening in that year, but we treat each one as a separate thing, and we refuse to see the patterns, or we refuse to pay attention to the patterns, right? So each one is a moment, and it's shock and horror, and then there's the concept of rape that we all oppose to. But we don't ask questions about, or we don't ask enough questions about, well, how is it that we're all shocked and horrified, and yet it happens all the time? What else are we doing to enable it? Why don't we know? Why do we know so much about the victims, the survivors, and so little about who the perpetrators are, right? And so we act as though they are Martians that fly in, rape, get back on their spaceship, and we have inferior technology on Earth, and they go off, and so there's all this evidence of rape, but there's no, and so I think that's part of it. But also, of course, we forget that rape does not, I mean, I think rape is a very important part of how patriarchy works. And so we have to think about what enables it. But we don't want to do that work. So everybody wants to be opposed in principle or theoretically to rape, but not to sexual violence more broadly, not to a violent gender power more broadly. And so, of course, we cannot end rape without addressing, while paying no attention to what it is for.
So you raised so many great points. And Aidija and I this morning were talking about the function of rape that you just alluded to within patriarchy, and how obscuring that function allows rape to continue. So if you could just speak to that a bit and share.
So this morning we're having a conversation about how rape is depicted even in articles, on newspapers, and in the social media space. For example, you see things like 20 women were raped in 2 months in a particular location, but you don't see anything about who were the rapists. Even the concept of, with all due respect, the concept of violence against women, it's a fantastic thing, but then there is no active person in that word. So what we're basically doing is violence against women, but who are the people perpetrating the violence against women? They are absolved of that responsibility, so they don't feel like it is my fight, or is it something I need to be a part of to end? It is violence against women, so women also need to address the issue that happened to them. It doesn't concern us men. And I also spoke to her about the issue of women's bodily autonomy. We are at a place where a woman is viewed as a property, and the value of our property is in our sexual purity. And so as such, when a girl is raped, you don't think about the girl that has been raped as the victim or as a singular entity that has been violated. you begin to think about how the man she's going to marry is going to feel about her being a victim of sexual violence. So you forget her existence as a person, but you begin to pay attention to the man that is going to marry her. And for me, that's really problematic. If we continue to think about the people who mostly perpetrate the violence and forget about the survivors themselves, that's a major issue. And that's why you have issues of violence against female sex workers, for example, because they are a property that you feel are already damaged, or you feel already do these things already, they're already having sex. So really, I don't really need to get a consent to actually violate her, to have sex with her. I can violate her at will. Because then again, our property, our value as a property has been defiled, because by herself, she's made a decision on what she wants to do. But then you feel that as a person, our value is gone. Who made you the judge of value?
Thank you. So now to flip the script a bit from how we make our societies safe for rapists to talk about what it is that makes women or survivors feel safe enough to come forward and talk about their rapes, and whether it is enough for us to ask women to come forward, or if there's more that we need to do to support them and then make bigger spaces safer for people to come forward.
Well, in the testimony sessions that I hold, they're not women only. By consent, they're mixed, as this audience is today. Because I think, in total agreement with what everybody has said, that legally we are no longer property in the UK. But it's only quite recent. And, but psychologically, we are still property. And so when women have some levels of sexual liberation in terms of, being able to have a sexual appetite and being able to have the right to choose whether they want to have children or not, it's almost like all these women are available as property, and you can pick which property you want. Now, that's not something that society discusses and says, but it's psychologically underneath everything. And I believe that two things have to happen. We have to ask men, and I am asking the men in this room too, to begin the conversations about male responsibility. Because in the end, we are asking women to support ourselves through very difficult situations, and rape isn't like an occasion, it's a lifetime. You're asking women to support themselves through that whole situation, both individually and in a community. And in my experience, most men say, well, it's kind of nothing to do with me because I didn't do it. But first of all, how are there so many women being raped and we can't find a man who's done it? I mean, either there's one man and he's just so busy, or a lot of men are raping and they're not acknowledging that they're raping. Now, I mean, this is a key thing, because I think that, we have an idea that rape always is extremely violent. I mean, physically, jumping out with strangers behind bushes with a knife. Sometimes, of course, it is, terribly. But very often it isn't. Very often it's a coercive moment by a partner, a friend, a fellow student, all kinds of people. And I think, knowing, men as I do, I've got one that I live with, and I've got a son, and I've got a dad. I think men think, well, if it got as far as that, it must have been okay. Because they can't think that they are rapists, because they have an image of a rapist just like we do. So I think that for women to feel safe about talking about all of this, I think men have got to acknowledge that they want to be in the conversation too, to listen, to learn, and to pick up language that they will start using amongst each other.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So Laura, I'm going to ask you a question about value. You said something earlier that in the end, ending rape is about teaching people to value women and girls. Or rape is about people not valuing women and girls. So I want to ask you a question about how women's value is debated in society. Ayodeji mentioned reading stories about defilement. And words like defilement, I think, imply that there has been something lost, something taken away from the person. So if a child is raped and we call it defilement, what we're saying is that purity is diminished, and so her value is diminished. What are the ways that you think people can reframe valuing women such that what happens to our bodies, or specifically our vaginas, doesn't diminish our value?
Thank you. I think part of that answer has to be about education, and in particular the education of boys. So we were just talking about the role of men. It's a shame we don't have any men on the panel, but I completely agree with what's been said. You know, and the theme of this panel is about language as well. Well, language is not just a language of rape narrowly defined. It's also when we tell boys, you know, oh, boys will be boys, or that kind of expression which is so pervasive in society would suggest it's okay to be a bit rough, you know, it's okay to be a little bit violent, because it's quite endearing because you're a boy. And so boys are brought up to believe that that's acceptable. Girls are brought up to believe that their value is in purity, and that their role is, you know, to do the dishes when their brothers don't. So I think we all have a role in challenging stereotypes, in calling out sexism when we hear it, and in educating our boys and our girls, which is fundamental, I think, to change the understanding. But, you know, patriarchy is hundreds of years old, and it's going to be a very long journey, I think, and sometimes it's 2 steps forwards and 1 step backwards, and sometimes it's 1 step forwards and 2 steps backwards. And I think we've got to recognize that fundamentally women have got to be in the room or at the table whenever decisions are made on our bodies, on sexual health, on reproductive health policies and the like, because unless we are, the fundamentals are not going to change either.
Thank you. So Poole, I'm going to bring this back to you and your reference to the manufacture of female fear, and how that ties into using sexual violence to regulate women's behavior. So I'm going to ask you this question directly, and I want the other panelists to contribute when you're done, to think about how women are told to behave to prevent rape, but also how we frame that women have made themselves rapeable by whatever actions that they take. So how is rapeability constructed in public consciousness, and how do we use female fear to sort of control that?
So in this book, in my one of my books, Rape in South African Nightmare, I talk about this thing, the female fear factory, or the manufacture of female fear, and I argue that rape is both the thing that women are most feared, are most reared to fear. So it's the product of the fear factory, but it's also, so it has this strange role that seems counterintuitive, right? So it's both the thing that you are threatened with, but it is also part of what rape does is to also create the female fear factory. And the female fear factory is about teaching women that our bodies don't belong to us, that public spaces don't belong to us. It's part of how patriarchy teaches us to self-censor and to monitor and to make ourselves smaller and to not resist in very specific ways. So I tell this story in one of the chapters, which I'm going to try to tell very quickly, about a woman, and this is kind of just an example of something that I think many of us who live in the world will recognize aspects of. Poole, who's a feminist activist and writer, walks into this shop in the middle of Johannesburg, CBD Johannesburg. There's a young woman the shop has various people. It's a small shop, but it has lots of people in it. She sees a young woman who's clearly getting unwanted attention from a young man. He tries to talk to her. She does all the things we raise globally our girls to do. She tries to communicate that she doesn't want to talk to him. She does various things. She looks away. She moves her body. She moves to a different part of the shop. He is unrelenting, because we also teach our boys that good girls are worth pursuing. That when women say no, they don't mean no. We say it's romantic to be rapey, to pursue and to court and all of these things. And then we say, what do you mean you were rapey? So he continues to follow her around. She moves. There are several other people in the shop. They look at her, they look at him, they do what they're doing, they mind their own business. Eventually, the young woman, after about 15 minutes of this, says, "Leave me alone." He turns around and he says, "You see, this is why we rape you." And everybody looks away, and crazy feminist Poole walks up to this man in a fit of rage and yells at him and says, "What do you mean this is why we rape you? How is this why we rape you? How many people have you raped?" And just kind of goes on at him. And this young man is shocked and flees. And when he flees, everybody else in the shop says, don't worry so much, don't worry yourself so much. Even the young woman who was being pursued is a bit taken aback. She's grateful, but she says, "Oh, don't worry." She now offers sympathy to the person who interrupts. And I like the story because I think it's a very quick way of illustrating various things that are very familiar, right? That this business of minding your own business, this entrenched notion also about not taking women's no's seriously, that is a global culture of romance, which also, of course, plays into this high, ridiculously dangerous notion of rape as sex, right? We know rape is not sex, of course. Rape is not, if I stab someone, nobody thinks that has anything to do with butchery, right? The knife is incidental to the violence. And yet, in rape, we often pretend that it is about sex. And in a culture where we're pretending that women's sex is for somebody else, and women, sex is not for them and their bodies do not belong to them, it makes sense that we and of course, there are no consequences, right? We also live in I live in a country where the highest office of the land is occupied by someone who was accused of rape, right? Where there are no real consequences. And I believe Kwezi. I believed her when she was alive, and I believe her today. And Kwezi was the complainant in the Jacob Zuma rape trial. So there are no real consequences. And so, and that's part of manufacturing the fear factory, right? So even if so we say break the silence. But what happens when you break the silence? What happens when someone grabs you in the street? There are no consequences. So we have this unreasonable expectation that women will act differently and are responsible exclusively for ending rape and for both managing themselves so that they're unrapeable, which is impossible, and are compliant to the ways in which we're terrorized by various patriarchal ways in which we're taught that we don't belong to ourselves, and certainly public space does not belong to us.
Does anyone else want to add?
I just wanted to talk about two different things. And the first one being a number of girls, when growing up, were taught that our sexuality is not for us. We're taught that we cannot demand for sex. As a girl, the sex is not for you. It's to be done on you by the man. But what is very problematic then again is you teach us that we should not request for sex, but then you also teach us to be scared of the persons who are meant to have sex with us because it can be violent, and most times it will be violent. It means there is a problem with us as a society because we're going forward and we're also going backward. You're telling girls this, but you're allowing boys to do that, and it's okay to do that. The second thing is, for most girls, when growing up, you have the perspective of this is what my femininity means to me. I'm sorry, I just lost my. I'm sorry. Let somebody. I'll come back. I'm sorry.
Okay, can I, while you wait, yeah. There's an interesting campaign happening at the moment, which is, you probably know because of Harvey Weinstein and Kevin Spacey. I mean, in the UK and across Hollywood and so on. And so there's this campaign saying "Me Too." And the positive thing about that is women going beyond the idea that they have to hold on to this personal shame and saying, actually, yes, I could tell you I was mugged 3 times, but I'm actually going to tell you that I was raped 3 times, or I'm actually going to tell you I was sexually violated 5 times. So they're trying to put Me Too into the same category as saying, other crimes happened to me, which I don't have to be ashamed of. And I think that is a very positive next step. I think that we as a community of women, have got to go Me Too, even though it's painful. And because I think as well, if we do that, an awful lot of women will suddenly track back and go, actually that does include me, doesn't it? Because I think even women have been taught to make this massive distinction between violent rape and every other kind of sexual violation, and put the other kind in a sort of, well, that's just the way it is. But why should it be what it is? It's that sort of general humiliation and degradation. So I think changing that language to Me Too together is a very important thing. And I think that we have to ask our mothers and our grandmothers to kind of come with us, even though they're going to find that hard because of this notion of purity. But the other thing I wanted to say is about identification with the act of rape. I have found that when men think about being raped, if they think about being penetrated as a man, unwillingly, they are horrified at that idea. They physically are repulsed by the idea of being invaded, physically penetrated. But when I asked men about that, they say, yes, but that's because we're not used to it. So but this isn't, I mean, just because we're shocked doesn't mean to say we should, let that go. I mean, I think a lot of boys and men would think, well, if it has been pleasant to be penetrated, why is it so unpleasant the next time if you didn't really want it? I think, honestly, there is a really difficult issue of psychological understanding by many men, empathy, if you like. And so they think that male rape is really terrible, whereas female rape is sort of like sex, but just not as nice. And I'm talking about, the kind of something like the non-violent intrusion that a lot of women experience. And so, I think your point, it is education, emotional education, not just sort of things that you oughtn't to do.
Sorry. I feel like we cannot end a conversation about rape without talking about what consent is. You've alluded to so much. We have 10 minutes, so my brain is like, but people are so resistant to the idea that rape is not just a person forcefully inserting a penis into a vagina and leaving bruises. People are so resistant to that idea, and I think part of it might be because then so many more people become what they imagine to be rapists, which is like, well, rapists are this other thing, and what I did with this person who was my girlfriend or who was my friend is something else entirely. So how do we start to expand the notion of what consent is? How do we start to really reinforce the idea that women have sexual agency? Women must be active participants in sexual contact, otherwise that is rape. And how do we get the people who are most likely to rape, aka men, to internalize this idea in meaningful ways? And is that even our job, or should men be doing this?
Okay, sorry I lost my thoughts. I was getting a bit emotional. I apologize about that. So about the issue of consent, there's so many variations to this. There is the attitudinal consent and the mental consent. And the mental consent is the one where men assume that mentally, if I'm dressed a certain way or if I'm at a certain place, it means I am ready for sex at any time. So for example, if I am at a man's house late night, he believes mentally I've consented to it. But there is a place for attitudinal and verbal consent where a person has to say yes. Not a coerced yes, not a threatened yes or intimidated yes. It has to be a yes where both parties understand what is about to happen and both parties align with the process. So how do we get men to start understanding what consent is? They need to open their minds and open their heads and listen to us. You need to listen. It's not about your ego. It's not about your penis. It's about how a woman feels at that time. There is nothing like, oh, I will die. You will not die. As a matter of fact, I've never heard of a man who stopped having sex and died immediately. It does not make any sense. But we need to get into our young men and even older ones, because we have There's something about mentally grooming someone to give consent. They mentally groom ladies, and sometimes you begin to even see like it was not his fault. I gave consent, but you didn't. You were mentally groomed to it, and men are very good with that. And you need to correct that perspective that you have, because we know now, we are aware about it, and we're no longer taking it at all. So I'm not here to tell any man what to do. I'm here to tell you to listen. If she says no, and no is no, it does not mean yes, she's not confused. If she's drunk, she cannot give consent. If she's at your house at late night, go and sleep, leave her alone. You need to listen.
So I completely agree with what Olu said. No means no. I mean, it's pretty easy. But also sometimes yes means no. And that's complicated because there are other forms of power that are not just in terms of physical power that men can exude on women. So we've seen again in the UK that there were groups of men grooming young girls and taking advantage. And it was psychological grooming before physical violence. So it's a complicated notion. But I think what we're seeing is that, you know, we've been talking about consent for decades and it's not really working. And one of the reasons that is, it's not because it's the wrong notion, but it's again the onus on and the emphasis on women, right? And what they said. What about men? What about them having to demonstrate whether, you know, in front of vulnerable women, how they acted? You know, could we turn it on its head a little bit? I think it's really quite important to, again, think about rape as exploitation. Did they take advantage of a particular vulnerability? I'd like to come back to a previous point. Earlier this week I was at a conference and we were talking about sexual harassment, and I was sitting next to a very senior and powerful lady, and she says, the other thing we need to think about is the way women dress here in Nigeria, right? And I must have looked quite baffled and quite shocked at that. And she said, no, but you know, it's not the same in the UK, but it's a very serious issue here. And so I was quite gobsmacked that I was hearing this in a conference that was about women's rights as well. And I think what I'm trying to say is two things. First of all, we've got to put to bed the notion that men are predators and that they can't control their sexual urges, right? So there's that stereotype which has got to be challenged, and we've got to think about what it is like to be a man, but clearly that is not part of a man's DNA, so we really need to challenge that myth. I'd like to think also about the role of women, right? So we've only just got to Me Too, to listening to women, to actually believing them, right? So these women, the Harvey Weinstein women, they've been abused for decades, and they've chosen not to speak up because they thought they wouldn't be listened to, or because they thought they wouldn't then not have any career. They didn't want to be seen as victims. You know, that means that every single person here would know something very intimate about me and would only ever see me, or not only ever, but you know, would see me in a way that's very personal. But all of this is also because society, including women, have not believed women. And I think we as women can also step up in the way that we engage, in the way that we work together, and in the way we take to the streets, in the way that we demand our rights, we demand respect. And I think this, you know, we have to work hand in hand with men, but we can also do better. And fundamentally, we're not always our best friends. There's this myth that we also should put to bed, that, you know, women backstab each other or bitchy with each other, whereas of course we can and should be something else. We should be about sisterhood and supporting each other and believing each other and putting ourselves first. We should be voting for women, coaching women, encouraging women. And if we did more of that, I think that would also be important.
Okay, yeah, so unfortunately we're out of time. I'm just going to close by saying that I know if I were to ask how many people in this room have experienced sexual violence, I would get a significant show of hands. Whereas if I were to ask how many people in this room have committed sexual violence, it would be dead silent. So what I want us to take away from this conversation, besides these incredible insights that these women have shared with us today, is introspection. Go back and look at yourself and ask yourself, what are the ways in which I use the power that I have not earned as a man to exploit women's vulnerability? I think we have to take questions now, or do we have time for questions, or are we? What's happening? Can we take questions? No time. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions, but I hope this conversation continues. Thank you so much for joining us.
She won the 2003 Kane Prize and is a past recipient of the Shevlin Scholarship and an Iowa Writers Fellowship. In 2004, she was named Woman of the Year by Eve magazine in Kenya for her contribution to the country's literature and arts. She was the executive director of the Zanzibar International Film Festival from 2003 to 2005. She has also been a TEDx Nairobi speaker and a Lannan Foundation resident. Please jam your hands together for her. And to my right is Ayobami Adebayo, who was born in Lagos. She holds a BA and MA degrees in literature and English from the Obafemi Awolowo University, where she also worked as an editor for Saraba magazine. Since 2009. I mean, she's still working as an editor in Saraba. She also has an MA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia, where she was awarded an international bursary for creative writing. Ayobami has received fellowships and residencies from many places in the world, including Ebedi Hills. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just going to introduce the books. For those who don't have it already, it's available. Okay, sorry, apologies. This is the Nigerian edition, published by Wida Books, and Dust. So these are the two books. They're available at the bookshop or the bookstore for those who need them. So let me just introduce the books. So Dust is about something that happens in contemporary Nairobi when a young man, Moses Odidi Oganda, bleeds to death in the streets, murdered by the police. According to Tai Selassie in a review, she said Dust concerns itself with Kenya's blood-soaked history from the Mau Mau uprisings of the early 1950s to the political assassination of Tom Mboya in 1969 to the post-election violence of 2007. Stay With Me, on the other hand, is a portrait of a Nigerian marriage between Yejide and Akin Ajayi, who are not my relatives, unraveling against the social and political turbulence of 1980s Nigeria. It is a devastating story of the fragility of married love, the wretchedness of grief, and the all-encompassing... I can't read my handwriting, I'm sorry. So I'll just go ahead to ask the questions. I'm going to ask a few direct general questions to both authors. And the first is this. You both have written wonderful, amazing first novels. And my question is, how do you as a writer deal with the weight or the burden of critical and commercial acclaim, especially of a first work? Aya, would you go first?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. How do you deal with it? I think it's still early days, actually. My book just came out in March. And I think the way I've dealt with it has been to step away from all of it as much as I can. My book came out in March and very quickly was reviewed by a lot of newspapers. And by the end of March, I simply stopped reading reviews because whether they were good, the ones I had read were very good. I found them a bit distracting from what I was doing, which was writing another book. So I just felt to myself, I'm not going to do this right now. I'm going to think about what I'm working on, and that's how I deal with it. Because who I am as a writer is what I wrote this morning. That's how I think about it, and that's how I choose to judge myself. There's this famous Michi Kapitania review which I'm saving for when I finish the next book. I haven't read it. When I finish the next book, that's my reward to myself, to go and read that. So that's how I think very quickly I told myself I just can't take in all of this. No.
Interesting. I didn't know you hadn't read Michiko's review. Wow. I don't even think Michiko knows you haven't read a review. But Yvonne?
Again, good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. This is my first visit to Nigeria and certainly to Africa. Yeah. Actually, you shouldn't clap for me. It's an overdue visit. You should say shame. How to deal with the flash and the fabulousness of the kind of spectacular first launch is simply enjoyed. What I did, quickly enjoyed, but after a while you learn to stop believing the bullshit. It's so important to do that so that you can get on with the task at hand, which I put very succinctly, which is actually get on with the next story. But to also, they certainly allow, to stop apologizing for the gifts that come with the moment and to embrace it, but to do so. Certainly for me, I had to learn to do so in moderation, just so that I could get on with the next book.
Thank you very much for that. You both came into fame or came into acclaim, first as short story writers. I know Yvonne won the Ken Prize. And Ayo, you actually wrote a short story that has similar themes with your novel. So how did you transition? How do you journey from being a short story writer to being a novelist? What is lost? What is gained? What are the intricacies? What are the anxieties?
I think that, so I had the idea for this book when I was in my final year in the university. And I was just too intimidated by the very idea of writing something as long as a novel. So I came to it with what I felt I could do. I wrote a short story that then metamorphosed into this. And in sort of working with the novel form, I just had to start doing it. I think that's what happens at the end of the day. You sit down and you do it. But what I did notice after I started writing Stay With Me was that I felt that the stories that I wrote became different. And I had to be very conscious about the form of the short story itself and what it demands and how you need to leave much more left unspoken. And I think that that's what I honestly noticed after I started working on the novel, that I was reaching for length more and more, perhaps because I'd worked with such a wider canvas, I think.
Okay, from short story to manuscript. When I wrote Weight of Whispers, which was the first story I wrote, which won a prize, I wrote it in 5 days, primarily to get rid of one of my friends, Binyavanga, who was calling me about 5 times a day for the story. But I thought that I would quickly transition into writing a novel, and since I wrote Weight of Whispers in 5 days, a novel would be what? At most 2 months? Well, 7 years later. But a lot of that was learning to be humble before the art, before the story. Learning all sorts of things about the nature and character of story making and the long form. I'm a bit of an impatient person, and I got a sense of where the story should go or where the story was going to go. And since there's no button to push and the book emerges, one has to actually sit down and write the bloody thing. That was a bit of a challenge.
Wow, you're a bit of an impatient person. This book didn't strike me like it was written by someone impatient. So we're going to just take readings from the book now. Okay. So we do reading from both books, and then we'll ask some other questions. So, Yvonne, a bit of context.
Okay, since this festival is also a celebration of the feminine, I will read from the part where a female character that I particularly like in this story, Akaima, appears on the scene And she's coming into the picture where her daughter, who has been away for a long time, and her husband has come home with a coffin of her son, her really beloved son. She flows like magma, every movement considered, as if it has come from the root of the world. Tall, willowy, wasp-waisted, her breasts still large and firm, she is made of and colored by the earth itself. Something ferocious peers out of dark brown eyes, so that even her most tender glance scowls. Her voice, a bassoon-sounding, gravel-colored afterthought. At unpredictable moments, for nameless reasons, she might erupt with molten rock fury, belching fire that damaged everything it encountered. Akai was as dark, difficult, and dangerous as one of those few mountains where God shows up, and just as mystifying. When he sees Akai, Nyipir's hands pour sweat. Ajan's bags slip from his grip and tumble to the ground. Galgalu, carrying a lit kerosene lamp behind Akai, lifts a hand to Nyipir in greeting. But Nyipir's eyes are fixed on the bald patches on Akai Ma's scalp where she has torn out her hair, scratches and tear marks on her face. Blood cakes her body in thin strips. One of Nyipir's AK-47s, the 4-kilogram 1952 with a wooden buttstock and handguard is strapped to her body, cradled in a green kanga with an aphorism written out on it. Nyipir shambles towards his wife. He is preparing to steer away from the echoes of a conversation that started one day in August 1998 after a distant living coward detonated a bomb in Nairobi. He should have known it was a forewarning. "My son," Akaima had wailed at him then, while a BBC radio news bulletin retold the story of an explosion in Nairobi. "I want my son." "He's safe," Nyipir had answered. Akai Lokorijem had said nothing, disappeared, reappeared, vaselined and fresh, with a small bag ready for a journey. Now where are you going?" Nyipir had asked. "To find my son." Nyipir had granted, "I'll go." Nyipir now inhales the orange sun, the dry grasslands and the chirping of early evening crickets to escape for even a second the horror of a story he must repeat to a mother. The roiling country, the murdered son. The fire in Galgalu's kerosene lamp wavers. Nyipir circles the area, hurries to shield Akai from seeing the coffin. Her mother, in Ajan, a concentration of absences from 7.5 years twinge in her heart like a torn string, clanging lost music. She exhales and bounds over, an eager dog closing in on its mistress. Akaima pivots, another direction. Ajan stops. Nyipir stretches out his arms. "Akai," he starts his explanation. Akai shoves him aside. He stumbles. She reaches the coffin. Wind hurls dust around a pair of creamy butterflies. Silence, soft-voiced. "Who is it?" Nyipir enters the breach. "Our son, Odidi." He bows his head. Akai asks, "Who is it?" "Odidi." "Who?" "Akai," pleads Nyipir. "No!" she explodes. She glares at them all, paces up and down a portion of the field, her arms thrown up and then down. Then she returns and pinches Nyipir's arm, her eyes sly. "Where's my son?" She won't wait for his reply. She returns to the coffin, clutching her waist, scratching her left arm. "Mama," Ajan calls. Akai waves a hand at the noise. "Nyipir, where's my son?" Nyipir's head swings left, right. I tried everything. I tried, he croaks, hands gesturing upward. Akai, Nyepir, I told you, bring my son home. Didn't you hear me? Nyepir's hands move upward again. His mouth opens and closes. Saliva clings to his jaw. Nyepir, where's my child? Akai's eyes bulge. Mama, stutters Ajan. Akai points at the coffin. Who? Galgalo moves closer. He props the lantern against the tree, uses his whole arm to wipe tears off his face. He had known it would come to this. He had known. Akai hobbles past. Show me. Galgalo unscrews the large bolts and opens the coffin lid. No time, no space. Akaima falls, arms stretched forward. She crawls, leans over Odidi's body, reaches in, takes it by the shoulders, holding him to her breast, keening in intermittent groans, lips on Odidi's forehead. She rocks her son, strokes his face, rocks her son. Odidi, she croons. Odidi, wake up. Son, listen. Obewesit, I'm calling you. To name something is to bring it to life. Thank you.
Wow. For me, that was very, very, very moving piece. Because, I mean, being a Yoruba person, you realize that, I mean, it's kind of forbidden for a mother or a parent to see the corpse of their kid. And, you know, reading this was quite moving. And I have a question about that, but let's take Ayo's reading.
So I'll be reading from a section a bit early on in the book. The protagonist, Yejide, has been married for a number of years, but she doesn't have any children yet. And her husband's family has taken a second wife now, and she's gone to visit her mother-in-law. I believed I was Mommy's favorite daughter-in-law. As a child, it was expected that I would call my stepmother's Mommy. Even my father encouraged me to, but I refused. I stuck to calling them Mama, and whenever my father was not around, some of the women would slap me just because I refused to honor them by calling them my mother. I did not refuse because I was being stubborn or trying to defy them, as a number of them concluded. My mother had become an obsession for me, a religion, and the very thought of referring to another woman as mother seemed sacrilegious, a betrayal of the woman who had given up her life for me to live. One year, the Anglican church my family attended celebrated Mothering Sunday with a special service. After the vicar delivered his sermon, he summoned everyone who was below the age of 18 to the front of the church because he wanted us to honor mothers with a song. I must have been 12 at the time, but I didn't get up until an usher poked me in the back. We sang a song that everyone already knew, an expansion of a popular saying. I managed the first line. Hiya ni wura hiya ni wura hiye piye ti hakole fowora, before biting my tongue to choke back tears. The words, "Mother is gold, mother is treasured gold that cannot be bought with money," resonated with me more than any homily I'd ever heard. I knew by then that my mother could not be replaced with money by a stepmother or anyone else. I was sure that I would never call another woman Mommy. Yet, every time my mother-in-law wrapped me in a fleshy embrace, my heart sang, Mommy. And when I called her the venerated title, it did not cling to my throat and refuse to climb out the way it used to when my stepmothers tried to slap it out of me. She lived up to the name, taking my side if any issue I had with hacking came to her attention, assuring me that it was a matter of time before I got pregnant for her son, insisting that my miracle would be waiting once I turned the right corner. When Mrs. Adeolu, a pregnant customer, told me about the mountain of jaw-dropping victory I went to Mommy that same day to discuss it with her. I needed her to authenticate the information. She was a treasure house of knowledge about such things. Even if she did not know anything about a miracle house, she usually knew whom to ask. And once she had checked out the stories, she was always prepared to accompany me to the ends of the earth to seek a new solution. There was a time when I would have ignored Mrs. Adeolu's words. A time when I did not believe in prophets who lived on mountains or priests who worshipped beside rivers. That was before I had so many tests done in the hospital, and every one of them showed that there was nothing preventing me from getting pregnant. I hoped at one point that the doctors would find something wrong, anything to explain why my period still showed up every month, years after my marriage. I wished they would find something they could treat or cut out. They found nothing. Akin also went in to get tested and came back saying that the doctors had found nothing wrong with him. Then I stopped waving aside my mother-in-law's suggestion, stopped thinking that women like her were uncivilized and a little crazy. I became open to alternatives. If I was not getting what I wanted in one place, what was wrong with searching elsewhere? My parents-in-law lived in Ayeso, an old section of town that still had a few mud houses. Their house was a brick building with a front yard partially enclosed by a low cement fence. When I arrived at the house, Mommy was sitting on a low stool in the front yard, shelling groundnuts into a rusty tray that sat on her lap. She looked up as I approached and looked down again. I swallowed and my steps slowed. There was something wrong. Mommy always greeted me by shouting, "Yejude, my wife." The words were as warm as the embrace that usually followed them. "Good evening, Mommy." My knees trembled as they touched the concrete floor. "Are you pregnant now?" she said, without looking up from the tray of groundnuts. I scratched my head. "Are you barren and deaf too?" I say, "Are you pregnant?" The answer is either yes, I am pregnant, or no, I still haven't been pregnant for a single day in my life. I don't know. I stood up and backed away until she was not within the reach of my clenched fist. "Why won't you allow my son to have a child?" She slapped the tray of groundnuts on the floor and stood up. "I don't manufacture children, God does." She marched towards me and spoke when her toes were touching the tips of my shoes. "Have you ever seen God in a labor ward giving birth to a child? Tell me, Yejide, have you ever seen God in the labor ward? Women manufacture children, and if you can't, you are just a man. Nobody should call you a woman." She gripped my wrists and lowered her voice to a whisper. "This life is not difficult, Yejide. If you cannot have children, allow my son to have some with Fumi. See, we are not asking you to stand up from your place in his life. We're just saying you should shift so that someone else can sit down." "I am not stopping him, Mommy," I said. "I have accepted her. She even spends the weekends in our house now." She held her thick waist and laughed. "I'm a woman too. Do you think I was born last night? Tell me, why has Haki never touched for me? He has been married to her for over 2 months. Tell me why he has not removed the wrapper once. Tell me, Yejide." I stifled a smile. It's not my business what Haki does with his wife. Mommy lifted my blouse and laid a wrinkled palm on my stomach. "Flat as the side of a wall," she said. "You've had my son between your legs for 2 more months, and still your stomach is flat. Close your thighs to him, I beg you. We all know how he feels about you. If you don't chase him away, he won't touch for me. If you don't, he will die childless. I beg you, don't spoil my life. He's my first son, Yejide. I beg you in the name of God." I closed my eyes, but tears still forced their way past my eyelids. Mommy sighed. "I have been good to you. I beg you in the name of God, Yejide, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me." She held me then, pulled me into her arms and muttered words of comfort. Her embrace held no warmth. Her words sat in my stomach, cold and hard, where her baby should have been.
Wow. Ayo, Loki, you didn't tell me that you're a singer like that, man. When is CD coming out? Okay, well, while you were reading, in a sense, you were reading in English, but I was hearing Yoruba. I don't know if anybody in the audience who's Yoruba. How did you come about that? Like, how are you able to use language such powerfully like that? I mean, are you able to transmute it? Like,
thank you for the compliment. How? Repeated failure. That's simply how it is. With this particular book, and each book, I think, determines sort of as a way that it determines the way it will be told. And with this one, with the setting, with the people, I felt that I wanted to do something with the language that reflected that on the page. And it was basically doing it over and over again and throwing out things that I wasn't satisfied with. And also being willing to have some things lost in translation, you know, knowing that there are readers from other parts of the world who might not pick up some of the nuances that would be obvious to someone who's Nigerian, but I felt that, okay, somewhere else in the story they'll get the gist, you know.
and still about language, Yvonne, your book is written in such lush prose. I'm tempted to even call you a poet, as it were. I mean, even though you're a novelist, I don't know if you've ever written poetry. But more importantly is about what you wrote about language. In your book, you said that the official languages of Kenya is English, Kiswahili, silence, and memory. And in a sense, reading Dust, I felt like it was like midway between interrogating silence and invoking memory. Can you speak to this?
Invoking silence, what invoking memory, and interrogating silences. Well, I imagine that there's so many ways of communicating, and I think the earlier panel was talking about shame and language, and there's a common thread about the way we deal with violations, especially of the intimate, personal kind. And when I mean intimate and personal, the violations a country visits on its own people is part of the pattern of the intimate and personal violence that also seem to produce shame, right? And sometimes, and certainly with reference to the Kenya I was talking about, I remember growing up in the time of extreme madness by the state. I was struck by the return to silences, the things that are not said. And even though they're not said, everybody is aware of what is actually happening. And again, with reference to that Kenya state, what also strikes me is that the assumption by the state eager to erase a particular narrative, a particular happening, a particular, say, for example, genocide, even though it will disappear from the face of, the national story or even in the media, in our case, like 50 years later, everything has kind of emerged. And it's a fascinating moment in Kenya right now because certainly as a writer who's curious about memory, I start to ask, where did the memory hide? And there are things that are emerging that I'd assumed people had forgotten and that are being languaged again. Yet, where had they gone in these last 50 years? Because there's no word, no sentence, not even a phrase that made reference to that particular happening. But they're here, and they're now, and they're being listed one after another. So I think that was part of both the interrogation and the invocation of the idea that there are ways of speaking that are not necessarily what we assume speaking to be.
And something interesting happened recently. Kenya had an elections this year, and your book came out in 2013 when Kenya was celebrating its 50th anniversary of our independence. what are your thoughts? Like, really, there was so much drama about it also. I mean, this particular election.
You're asking about the current if I'm being mean, the current election is a continuation of all the elections that we had not really completed in the past. And it's an ongoing narrative that had been put on pause. There's been no election that has been complete. And this particular situation right now is simply the collapse of a lot of the illusions and delusions we had constructed to pretend that elections were actually taking place. And let's see, it's in a place, we're in a state of flux right now. There are all sorts of eruptions occurring. And some of the Kenyans will, I got some information from one of my Kenya-based friends, who's right here, Zukiswa, who's telling me about the sense of both surprise but empowerment of a country that has decided to perform a boycott, a national boycott. It's never happened before. So what can I say? The election is still in the process of unfolding.
Your book is a very personal story of a marriage disintegrating, but also it's against the backdrop of the 80s Nigeria, and we all know what the 80s means. I mean, military incursions, assassinations of the likes of Delegiwa. And my question really is, I'm interested in your choices as in why did you choose the 80s as opposed to the 90s? Because I seem to find similarities with it. I mean, 80s and 90s, it was essentially a continuum of military dictatorship. But I mean, if you have someone like Delegiwa who was assassinated in the 80s and it was, nobody really know what really went wrong. There was a Kensaruwa that was actually killed. I'm interested in your choices. Why did you make these choices? Okay,
before I answer the question, a digression, my personal obsession. The Nigerian House of Rep is still saying that Kensaruwa's death, as of 2 days ago, they're still saying that it was a lawful execution. So, yeah, that's very interesting to think about in terms of where we've come as a country and how far we've come. But I think I was interested in the 80s because I think it was a very interesting moment. What was to come in the 90s was, of course, a follow-up. But in the 80s, we had something very significant, I think, happen. And, I mean, language matters, and it's powerful. So we had a military dictator who essentially started calling himself a president. I mean, he just honed the title, no elections, nothing. And, and it was all of a sudden President Babangida. And I think that even if you read the interactions that people still had, I think it was a moment in that in some ways, I mean, we had military governments before, but it was different in terms of the fact that all the people that had come before were apologetic about being there. It was, we're here temporarily, and we all know that democracy is the best thing, and we're going to get out. This was someone who was trying to push a narrative that somebody can basically hijack power and somehow legitimize that fact. So that's one of the reasons why I was interested. I feel like there was a shift in that time in terms of how we engage with the country as citizens. If you look at, say, with the Vatsa coup and when Vatsa was going to be executed, you still had many people going to Babangida rather. You had writers, coming together and saying, we're going to talk. I mean, now, I don't think anybody would have thought in 1996 that you could reason, with whoever was in power, because events like that made us to realize, I think, that the people who were in power did not see us as citizens. It was really that simple. And I feel like many of those things still carry on now. The way that our lives changed, our engagement with the government, even the way most Nigerian middle-class people, including the couple in this novel, try to insulate themselves from the insanity that's going on. So there's armed robbery, you build a higher fence. I mean, that's just what you do. And that's what they do here. And even if you look at the architecture, you see houses that were built before that time. There's just a low fence, like I read. And then all of a sudden, there are these fences that nobody can see what's inside the house. So I feel like it was an important moment. And I was just, Yes, I'm obviously very interested in it.
Very nice. Still on politics, and I don't know how we go here. Yvonne, you wrote about Fela in the early pages. Moses, the character or the protagonist, who died in the beginning or before the book began, was he was singing or he was theorizing or thinking about Fela's music, and quite incidentally, you happen to be in Fela's hometown. Yeah, and I knew that you have one or two things to say about where Fela won, and then also two about this Fela song called "Teacher Don't Teach Me Nonsense," which is actually Fela saying that, well, all these things, all these failures of former colonies, of whatever colonial masters, all these failures are basically a legacy of that colonization. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Wow. That's tough. That's a tough one. But it's not I don't entirely agree that it's necessarily it's fully a failure, or I mean the failures and the crisis a lot of our countries, our post-independent nations encounter are because of necessarily the colonial legacy. I think the more painful legacy is the one we prefer not to talk about, the one that dares not speak its name, is the post-colonial betrayal. The betrayal of the post-colonial nation, of our dreams, our aspirations. It is more painful and more shameful to say that, to acknowledge the fact that our dreams had been broken by our own. You understand? And to grieve the loss, to grieve and it's a very intimate and terrible betrayal by those whom we had once believed would carry our flags to the greatest of heights, and instead have dug increasing bigger and bigger pits for us, where they not only bury our dreams but disappear our bodies, and then run another election in which they can repeat the pattern. And then we also collude with we collude in silence, because it's shameful, isn't it? And I'm glad I can say that here. It is shameful, and it hurts. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sure the audience have questions. At this point, we're going to take questions. We need a roving mic. Please keep your questions as questions and keep your comments short. Thank you. The lady there, please can you pass the mic on to her? Okay. The man in black and the other man there. I'm trying to be... Oh, and then yourself. Thank you. So we'll answer those questions and then we'll see if we can still take some more. Your name? And if you can stand.
Good evening.
Nice.
My name is Abubakar Ivuti. My question is to Ayo. So some months back we were discussing your book at a club in Kaduna. So there was a debate that erupted. We were unable to reconcile the fact that somebody like your I'm not sure it's going to be a spoiler per se, but I just want to say that the conflict of the book, which is the fact that a man is unable to impregnate his wife, what we are unable to reconcile is... I'm sorry about that, but...
just ask a question, yeah.
Okay, we are unable to reconcile the fact that a woman like Yejide...
Naivety.
Yes, the naivety. How could somebody like Yejide be that naive?
Yeah.
So I understand your question. I've gotten it before.
Yeah, okay.
So I'll just take
let's
it
take
quickly.
the questions, then we'll take answers.
Oh, okay.
Another question, yeah, from Bio. What happened to the lady here with the question? Okay, please, I need the mic to her too.
Okay.
Bio, ask your question, please.
Okay, well, I think the question will go to both of them. I want to ask about memory. And thank God Vaughn mentioned something about people trying to wipe, like politicians or leaders trying to recreate society in their own image by wiping out the memory. So what roles do both of you think, you know, especially with the kind of books you've written, especially Yvonne now, what roles do you think writers can play? Or do you think writers are actually doing enough, first of all, to make sure society's memory, so that this memory is not wiped out? Like, these people don't succeed in recreating this in their own image. And then, whether you think they're doing right or not, what do you think writers or people who are interested in literature can actually be doing in that regard? That's the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The question, please, okay. To the lady in green, yeah. Green and yellow. Okay, that's right.
I've read the two books. I've read Yvonne's Dust and I've read Ayobami's Stay With Me. And they're two different books in the sense that for me, Dust was, we already knew the end and it was more about the journey. And then with Ayobami, I was so anxious about getting to the end of the book because I had my own ending in mind. And so my question is, when you're writing and you're setting the style for your book, for the two authors, do you say, I want my reader to enjoy this journey, to enjoy the language, to just, you know, take it piece by piece? Because the truth is, I haven't finished Yvonne's Dust because it's a very heavy book, and the language, I just want to enjoy every piece of poetry in it, like Haile Selassie's Ghana Must Go. But with Ayobami, I really was rushing through it like a speed train, wanting to get to the end and get to the climax of the book. But how do you set the tone for your book before you even start writing it in terms of style?
Yeah. So, thank you very much. So we'll take the answers. Ayo. Okay, yes. A question? Let's take that and we'll take all the answers. I hope we have enough time.
Hi, I was hoping, this is for both of you, I was hoping that you could talk about how you feel about the reactions to your book in different parts of the world. So maybe how the reaction has been different. I'm curious, particularly in the West, because I'm from there. But how do you respond to the reactions to your books in other countries versus your home countries?
Okay. Yeah, so, okay, yeah. So, would you go first to answer the question? You have more.
So,
for now, let's just answer those questions and see if we have more time.
So I'll start with the gentleman. So if you've read the novel, you'll understand what I'm saying. If you've not, it's reason to buy it. The question of naivety, I think there are three parts to it. There's the reality that she's also a bit naive, at least in the beginning of the relationship. You have to understand what her background is. She's someone who has grown up without the very important network of women that are essential in your life as a girl child in this part of the world, because that's where you get all your education from. Nobody's going to talk to you about these things in school. We don't have room for that. And then there's also, after a point, there's the question of denial. So after a point, it's not that she doesn't know on some level what's going on, it's that she's not willing to look at it or face the consequences of looking at it and admitting to herself that this was going on. Because when you name something, when someone who's close to you betrays you, a kind of intimate betrayal, there's a sense in which you internalize what has happened, and you feel that there are all these questions that you might not be ready to deal with. So it's not just one motivation. There's the naivety and there's the fact that I think that I might speak for many people that there are just certain things in our lives that we're not ready to confront, and therefore we go on and just go on. It's not that we're not aware on a level we know, but we're just not ready for that. So I hope that takes care of that. On the question of memory and the roles of writers. In terms of memory, I guess that one of the things that could be done is to write these things into being, you know. I think that that's one thing you can do as a writer if that is what you care about. And as much as I care about this subject, I'm very wary of telling writers, this is your duty. You have to write this. I think that writers, your job is to write the story that you care about. It might be political, it might not. You know, that's your job, and that's your description. But if you are someone who cares about it, then one of the things you can do is do the research, get to know these things, ask questions, get the books, go to places, and write it into being in whatever way you can. Okay, what do you think about when you're writing? It depends on the book. It depends on the story. It depends on... It changes from time to time. There are things that I've written that it's not even about the story. I tell you what has happened at the beginning, so you know it's about why and how did we get here. So each book, that's the sense I have with my own writing. Each book, each story, it's a process of discovering the voice that is necessary, the way the story demands, in a sense, to be told. I hope that makes some sense to someone. And yeah, and feeling about reactions to the book in different countries. I'm not sure if it's been very different. I feel like, but I do feel that what I have been astonished by, and I have to say this, is how very warmly many Nigerians have received this novel. Thank you very much. Everywhere I go, I mean, there's always Nigerians in the room, and I love Nigerians, but this experience has been exceptional. So I don't think it's been very different. There have been a few quite weird questions that I've gotten from people where I'm like, well, that's not the point of my book, you know. But maybe in the West, and where people are sort of very interested in talking about the anthropological aspects of the book, and it's just, I'm like, I'm sorry, that's not my point. But it hasn't been as much. There's a sense in which you are dreading that kind of response, but it hasn't been so much, to be honest.
Okay, about memory. I would answer the question less as a writer and more as an artist. And there's a role of the artist that we don't quite, the character of the artist that is not necessarily greatly emphasized in a lot of places, that of witness, and as a witness to the human experience. All sorts of things are hidden in the message of the artist, whether in song or art or in the stories that we tell. I don't think memory has so many ways. Memory is creative. It finds so many ways to keep itself memorable. Yeah, and so whatever the politicians do, they will never get away with it. There's always something there's always a record of that somewhere. About the story and style, as Ayobam puts it, very much the story tells you what it wants. I wrote my first version, my first draft of Dust was under another name, was a completely different story than that which emerged, and it was all wrong. So I had to embrace what emerged, whether I liked it or not. About reaction, it's very interesting. When the book Dust was launched in Kenya, there's a special launch in Kenya. It kind of divided people according to political inclination. There are those who loved it, and there were those who loathed it. But the best reaction for me has been from a new generation, a younger generation, who have been referring to the text as a way of looking at their own country again. The other reaction, and I think the best reaction, was meeting a young man in the streets of Nairobi. I was minding my own business, and he comes up to me and says, "You're the author of Dust?" I say, "Yes." And then he says, I was waiting to hear all those lovely things that one ought to hear. And he says, "On page 23, there's a mistake. On page 48... on page 48, you dropped the character." And he showed me his book where he had lined up. I went, it's kind of rewarding as well. But again, because it's been translated, I'm overwhelmed by the sense of and the power of a story, finding its own life and its own people. I've been touched by especially the German reaction, they're behaving as if the book was never written in English, and using it to interrogate. In many places where I travel in German society, they use the book to look at their own histories rather than look at Kenyan histories. I mean, I think very much about reaction. Yeah. A story is its own thing. Yes. Thank you.
A story is its own thing. I have one question for both of you, and I must ask this question because I have many questions I'm not asking. What is the human cost of writing a novel? I mean, of sitting with these characters, of imagining them into being, and then having to live through their experiences vicariously. How do you do it? Okay, you have the mic. You go first.
Also, it depends on the story. With this novel, it was quite difficult, to be very honest. And I think one of the reasons why it took so long was that at some point I didn't want to go back to Yejide's story, because it was so painful to inhabit this woman's perspective and all of the tragedy that happens to her. I remember there was a time when I was working on on the HEME program and the creative writing MA, and I'd been writing all day, and it was summer, and so it was still bright outside around 9, and I just had to walk, and I was walking, and I realized that I didn't know where I was anymore, and I had to find my way back with Google Maps. So it can be difficult, you know, to do this, but I mean, I don't like to complain about it. It's what she chose to do. And one of the things that's been gratifying, okay, I'll talk about, there's a scene in the book that it went through several drafts. If you've read it, it's where Yejide goes up on a mountain. And it was there right from the very beginning. And every time I came back to that novel, I kept asking myself, why is this here? I mean, it was one of the things I struggled with, because I didn't want to experience it with her every time I had to rewrite it. And a while ago, someone got in touch with me who had read the book and said, oh, I gave my mother this book. And she said to me, and we talked for about 5 hours about this kind of things. And she told me how her friend had experienced exactly the same thing. And I felt like, yes, that's why it had to be in the book. Because this experience, these things do happen. And we need to see them. We need to face them. So I feel like there's a cost if you want to get in there with the characters, but I feel like with this one, I mean, with that conversation, I felt like, yes, it was worth it.
Okay, the human cost, actually, well, I think I'll deal, how would I answer this question? The human cost that comes to mind is the fact that a lot of my friends now look at me sideways, because they know I'm listening in, and they know that none of their experiences will go wasted. And sometimes, there's a part of you that kind of kicks in, and you know, I hope it doesn't sound too callous. You know, some of a friend was going through a horrible time in a relationship breakup, and I'm deeply sympathetic, and I love this person so dearly. But there's a part of me that's saying, yes, okay, and that's the emotion. That's the reaction. What a lovely word. This is how to say shit. Okay. So there's that. One leaves with it.
Yeah, thank you very much. With that, we've come to the end of the book chat. Please jam your hand together. Yeah, so the books are available at the bookshop. You should buy it, and you can get it autographed with the authors. Thank you very much.